What would you do if you paid for a first-class seat only to be told you didn't belong there? Would you stay silent, or would you give it up to avoid conflict? On Flight 451, one man was asked to surrender his seat, not because he hadn't paid, not because he had broken a rule, but for reasons no one dared to speak out loud. The man was Dr. Adrian Cole, a calm, dignified passenger in seat 2A. What neither the crew nor the other passengers knew was that Adrian wasn't just another traveler. He was the founder and chairman of the very airline they were flying on. And in that moment, with the weight of prejudice pressing against him, he had a choice: stand or stay seated. What followed was a chain of events no one could have predicted: an entire flight delayed, a crew removed, and a global conversation ignited. But how did he remain so calm, and what deeper truth does his silence reveal? Stay with us as we uncover the story of a seat not surrendered, a lesson in dignity that still echoes today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss stories that will move your heart and challenge the way you see the world. The afternoon air carried the crispness of autumn, the kind of chill that kissed the skin, yet warmed the soul with its golden light. At Lakeview International Airport, just outside Chicago, the runways stretched endlessly beneath a sky streaked with pale orange. Travelers moved in every direction, some rushing with the nervous energy of tight connections, others strolling with the luxury of time. Among them was Dr. Adrian Cole, a man whose pace was neither hurried nor idle. Adrian was 49 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that caught the sunlight as he walked toward the gate. His gray suit was simple but impeccably tailored, and his shoes struck the floor with a quiet rhythm, steady and purposeful. Unlike most travelers who carried the tension of schedules, Adrian walked with the ease of someone who respected time enough never to rush it. He had arrived nearly 40 minutes early, as he always did. Not because he feared delays, but because he believed arriving early was a form of respect for himself, for the journey, for those who would cross his path. To him, time was not just minutes ticking away. It was a stage upon which dignity was measured. At the gate for Flight 782, bound for Denver, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Businessmen in navy blazers tapped at phones. Families corralled children who clutched stuffed animals and juice boxes. A young couple whispered eagerly about mountain hikes waiting in Colorado. The hum of everyday life was everywhere, ordinary and unremarkable. Adrian took a seat by the window, leather folio in hand. He opened it briefly to glance at notes for a meeting scheduled the following day in Denver. His company, Aurelius Airways, was in the midst of announcing a new initiative to reshape passenger experience. Ironically, most people in the terminal had no idea the calm man at the corner was the very founder and CEO of the airline they were about to board. He preferred it that way. He wasn't a man who sought recognition in airports. He'd rather be another traveler among many, unnoticed, free from the weight of titles. Yet even in his silence, he carried an aura that drew second glances, the posture of someone who had weathered storms and still stood tall. Boarding began with the usual choreography: first families with small children, then first-class passengers. Adrian rose, scanned his boarding pass, and offered the gate agent a polite nod. She returned the gesture with routine professionalism, not recognizing him, which suited him fine. The jet bridge hummed beneath his steps, metallic echoes mingling with the muffled roar of engines warming in the distance. Adrian's hand brushed the wall as he entered the plane, a small ritual he'd kept since childhood flights, a silent blessing for safety. Inside, the first-class cabin glowed with soft lighting. Cream-colored leather seats gleamed beneath overhead panels, and the faint scent of fresh linen lingered in the air. It was a sanctuary designed for comfort. Yet Adrian had long known that comfort could be deceptive. Spaces like these, intended to symbolize equality through wealth, often carried unspoken hierarchies. He found seat 2A, placed his briefcase beneath, and settled in. The seat molded to his frame as though it remembered him. He loosened his tie, opened the folio again, and scribbled a brief note to himself. Dignity is not optional. To his right, in seat 2C, a man in his early 40s sat with one leg stretched out arrogantly into the aisle. His polo shirt bore the logo of a golf club, and a watch with a golden face caught the cabin light. Without so much as a nod, the man continued scrolling through his phone, oblivious to Adrian. In seat 1B, just ahead, a woman with auburn hair tied neatly into a bun adjusted her glasses and glanced briefly toward Adrian. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than courtesy required. There was curiosity there, perhaps recognition, though she said nothing. Adrian gave her a polite nod, which she returned before returning to her book. The rest of the cabin filled slowly. Passengers shuffled bags into overhead bins, exchanged brief greetings, adjusted recliners. To an outsider, it was an ordinary boarding, the kind that happens thousands of times a day across the world. Yet Adrian felt it the subtle difference in how eyes slid past him, how attendants who greeted others offered him only perfunctory acknowledgement. He had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. Respect in such spaces was too often conditional, granted by assumption of belonging, and though he had built an empire of aircraft and routes, he knew there were still those who saw only skin before status. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. He inhaled deeply, letting the quiet hum of air vents fill his lungs, and exhaled with control. Inside, a familiar thought returned. Every journey tests more than the distance between cities. Sometimes it tests the distance between perception and truth. He remembered his father's words from decades ago. Son, you don't have to fight every battle with your fists. Sometimes the strongest fight is the one you win by standing still. As passengers continued boarding, Adrian felt the shift before it happened. The atmosphere grew heavier, whispers at the cabin entrance, the sharp voices of children negotiating seats with their parents. A family had entered late, a husband in a wrinkled shirt, a wife clutching a diaper bag, 2 small children tugging at her hand. They paused at the curtain separating first class from the main cabin. Adrian didn't yet know how significant their arrival would be. He only sensed that the rhythm of the flight, calm and predictable, was about to be interrupted. For now, he remained still, hands folded over his folio, gaze steady on the soft glow of the overhead light. In his silence, he carried the weight of countless journeys, countless dismissals, countless tests of patience. He didn't speak, but everything about his presence whispered one truth. He belonged here. What no one in the cabin realized yet was that this man, quiet in seat 2A, held a power that would soon change not only the course of their flight, but the culture of the airline itself. And Adrian, with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for the right moment, simply sat, ready. The hum of the aircraft deepened as more passengers trickled into the cabin, the sound of rolling suitcases mixing with the murmur of polite greetings, and the faint clink of glassware being arranged by attendants. First class had its own rhythm, an unspoken choreography that gave off the illusion of serenity. The wide seats glowed under amber lighting, their leather surfaces polished to a soft sheen. Freshly folded blankets and pillows had been set neatly in place, and the faint aroma of brewed coffee and citrus-scented wipes lingered in the air. Dr. Adrian Cole remained still in his seat, watching as the cabin around him filled with faces. There was a quiet order to it, the kind of elegance that was supposed to make everyone inside feel privileged, secure, and respected. Yet Adrian, as he often did, felt the subtle undercurrent beneath the polished surface. The smiles exchanged between some passengers seemed warmer than the ones directed at him. The nods of acknowledgement appeared more genuine when aimed elsewhere. He had experienced this countless times, in boardrooms, at charity galas, even in private clubs where his membership fees outweighed most. The sense that respect was always conditional, measured first not by the accomplishments in his life, but by the shade of his skin. He had long since learned to absorb it quietly, not with resentment, but with a kind of patient resilience. Still, the pattern never escaped him. In the seat directly to his right, Gregory Lane adjusted his posture, stretching one arm arrogantly across the armrest that separated them. His cologne hung sharp in the air, a citrus blend too bold for the confined space. Without glancing at Adrian, he pressed his call button and requested a sparkling water before the crew had even begun beverage service. Gregory carried himself with the entitlement of someone who had always been catered to, his watch gleaming as though it were a statement rather than an accessory. When the attendant returned with his drink, Gregory offered a smile and a casual remark about his golf game the weekend prior. The attendant laughed politely, the exchange smooth and easy. When Adrian asked a moment later for a simple glass of water, the attendant's smile flattened. The response was quick but perfunctory, as though serving him carried no social reward. The glass was placed on his tray table without the same warmth or chatter. Adrian nodded politely, masking the small sting that came with being treated as less. It was a detail most passengers would overlook, but to him such moments stacked like stones over the years, each one a reminder that he was always being measured differently. In the first row, Evelyn Hart closed her book briefly, adjusting her glasses as she looked around the cabin. She noticed the differences, too. She had always been a quiet observer, the kind of person who noticed what others missed. Though she did not yet know who Adrian was, she felt the air shift whenever he interacted with staff, as if invisible lines were being drawn. Her intuition told her that something more was unfolding than a simple flight to Denver. Adrian leaned back into his seat, the leather sighing beneath him. He took a slow sip of his water, gazing at the cabin with an expression that betrayed neither frustration nor expectation. He was not here to demand recognition, nor was he here to assert his authority. This was supposed to be a simple journey, another routine flight among the hundreds he had taken. Yet, as he sat in silence, he could not help but feel the tension of what lay beneath the surface. He thought briefly about his daughter, Maya, a law student in her 20s who often challenged him to confront injustice more directly. She would have told him to raise his voice, to call out the microaggressions and the dismissals. But Adrian had chosen a different path, one rooted in discipline and composure. His father had taught him that the loudest room is not always where change begins. Change often begins with stillness, with the decision not to move. A flight attendant passed by again, balancing a tray of sparkling water. She greeted Gregory Lane with another smile, ignored Adrian, and continued forward. Adrian exhaled softly through his nose, his patience steady. His mind flickered with the memory of a conference years ago when a host had mistaken him for a driver rather than the keynote speaker. He had walked onto the stage moments later, commanding silence with nothing but his presence. He remembered the flush of embarrassment on that host's face, the way the entire room shifted once they realized who he was. Even here, in a cabin meant to represent privilege, he was reminded that privilege was not equal. The irony did not escape him. He had built Aurelius Airways from the ground up, envisioned every detail from seating to service, yet even on his own planes, he could be treated as an afterthought. The truth was bitter, but undeniable. Respect in society was still rationed, and men like him often found themselves holding empty bowls. Adrian's fingers tapped lightly against his folio, a rhythm born of deep thought. He reminded himself to remain calm, to let dignity frame his response to the world around him. There would be moments ahead, he sensed, that would test that resolve. Passengers continued boarding, and the cabin filled with small conversations, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of jackets being folded into compartments. A young man walked past, casting Adrian a glance that lingered too long, as if questioning why he was there. Adrian returned the look with calm eyes, a subtle affirmation that he needed no one's permission to belong. Evelyn Hart observed again, her curiosity sharpening. She had seen men like Gregory before, loud with confidence, quick to claim space. But there was something different about the man in 2A. He carried himself with the silence of someone who could command a room without raising a word. She closed her book, slid it into her bag, and decided she would watch more closely. Something told her that he was the kind of man whose story was larger than the seat he occupied. Adrian leaned back, his gaze fixed on the window where the fading light of autumn painted streaks of orange against the horizon. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine the mountains waiting in Denver, the meeting rooms where strategies would be drawn, the new projects that would shape the future of his company. But even as he pictured progress, his intuition whispered that the true test of this journey would not take place in boardrooms or contracts. It would take place here, in the narrow aisle of a plane, under the watchful eyes of strangers, in the silence between words unspoken. The cabin gave the illusion of peace, yet beneath it, Adrian felt the tremors of something approaching. He did not know exactly when it would strike, but he recognized the familiar pattern. A challenge was coming, one that would force him once again to decide between silence and assertion, between patience and protest. He closed his eyes briefly, breathed deeply, and whispered to himself words he had carried since boyhood. Stand your ground. Do not yield. Dignity is not optional. In the polished stillness of first class, Adrian Cole sat unmoved, yet within him. The storm of memory and anticipation grew stronger with every passing second, and as the final passengers began to trickle down the aisle, dragging behind them the last whispers of ordinary travel, the stage was being set for something far greater than any of them expected. The aircraft door gave a faint metallic thud as the last group of passengers made their way down the jet bridge. Most of the cabin had settled, the overhead bins nearly full, the hum of conversation fading into a calm hush. Adrian Cole shifted slightly in his seat, folding his hands together, his eyes resting on the soft pattern of light on the bulkhead in front of him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a quiet, uneventful flight, a chance to read, to sip coffee, to retreat into thought without interruption. But peace is often fragile, and on airplanes it can vanish in the space of a single breath. The hush broke with the arrival of a young family at the front of the cabin. The mother appeared first, her hair pulled back hastily into a bun, her face carrying the weariness of long travel. She clutched a diaper bag against her chest while guiding a small boy who clung to her hand. Behind her, the father juggled a suitcase in one hand and the arm of a toddler in the other. The children's voices were soft but restless, the sound of small feet scuffing against the carpet. The mother paused just at the curtain between first class and the main cabin. Her eyes darted quickly over the seats, scanning for openings, calculating space. Her gaze lingered on Adrian's row. She leaned closer to a flight attendant standing nearby and whispered something. The attendant nodded and turned her head toward Adrian. Adrian felt it before it happened. The shift in energy, the tightening of silence, the way conversations seemed to falter as though the cabin sensed an approaching disruption. The flight attendant approached. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with neatly styled brown hair tucked behind her ear. Her name tag read Chloe Myers. She walked with a practiced smile, the kind of expression that seemed polite at first glance but carried strain beneath the surface. She stopped beside Adrian's seat, leaned slightly forward, and spoke in a tone both gentle and expectant. "Sir, we have a family traveling with young children who've been separated in the main cabin. Would you be willing to give up your seat so they can sit together?" Her words floated politely. But Adrian caught the undercurrent. He had been in this position too many times not to recognize it. The assumption that he was the most movable piece in the puzzle. The expectation that his cooperation was inevitable. He looked up slowly, his expression calm, his voice even. "Did you ask any of the other passengers in this cabin?" The question hung in the air, heavier than its words. Chloe blinked, caught off guard. Her smile faltered, though she tried to maintain composure. "Well, no," she admitted after a pause. "We thought you might be more flexible since you're traveling alone." Adrian studied her face, his silence pressing into the pause between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his stillness carried its own authority. Around him, other passengers began to notice. Gregory Lane in 2C glanced up from his phone, a hint of curiosity in his smirk. Evelyn Hart leaned slightly forward in 1B, her book forgotten in her lap, her eyes narrowing as she took in the exchange. The rest of the cabin shifted subtly, passengers pretending not to stare while their ears sharpened to catch every word. Adrian's mind flickered with memories. Being asked as a child to step aside at a playground swing because someone else deserved it more. Being told in college that he had been admitted only to fill a quota. Being mistaken for an assistant in rooms where he was the keynote speaker. Every time, the same pattern: "You don't belong here. Step aside." He took a breath, steady and measured. His voice was calm, but it cut through the air with precision. "So the only person you've asked to move is me." Chloe hesitated again. The silence stretched, thick enough to tighten the chest. "Finally," she answered, "Yes, sir, just you." The words rippled through the cabin. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The father of the young family stood awkwardly near the curtain, avoiding eye contact, while the mother clutched her child tighter, her face pinched with both embarrassment and quiet expectation. Adrian kept his gaze steady. His eyes carried not anger, but a piercing clarity that unsettled Chloe. He spoke softly, almost gently, but his words struck like iron. If the issue is fairness, then fairness would require that everyone be considered. Not only me. The sentence silenced even the faint murmur of children. Chloe's throat worked as she swallowed, her confidence unraveling. "We just thought," she began, her tone faltering, "it would be easiest." Adrian leaned back slowly into his seat, his hands folding once more across his folio. What's easiest isn't always what's right. The line cut clean. Final. He said nothing further, and his silence was louder than any argument. The cabin seemed frozen. The passengers looked from Chloe to Adrian, from Adrian to the family, caught in the unspoken question of why the request had been directed only to him. A few shifted uneasily, recognizing the undercurrent of bias. Others averted their gaze, preferring not to confront it. Gregory Lane smirked faintly, as if amused by the tension, but did not offer his seat. Evelyn Hart's jaw tightened as she glanced at Adrian, admiration flickering in her eyes. She recognized the weight he carried, the quiet strength it took to respond with composure rather than outrage. Chloe's face reddened slightly, She straightened, her professional mask slipping, but not entirely gone. "Of course, sir. I understand," she said quickly, though her voice trembled faintly. She turned and walked back toward the family, murmuring softly. The mother frowned but said nothing, while the father gave a resigned nod. They shuffled toward their seats in the main cabin, their children tugging at their arms. But the silence in first class remained heavy. Passengers glanced discreetly toward Adrian, measuring him anew. Some carried quiet respect, others discomfort. No one spoke. Adrian sat motionless, his gaze fixed forward. Inside, his thoughts churned. He had not wanted confrontation. He had not boarded this plane to become a symbol. He had only wanted to travel with dignity. Yet, once again, dignity had been challenged, and once again he had been forced to defend it. Not through force, not through anger, but through stillness. He wondered briefly if he should have said more, if he should have raised his voice, made clear to the entire cabin what had just happened. But deep within, he knew silence often echoed louder than shouts. People would remember not his words, but his refusal to yield. Evelyn Hart opened her bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it on her lap. Screen, dark but ready. She had the instinct of someone who knew moments like these mattered. She was not sure yet if she would record, but she felt drawn to capture what might unfold. Adrian's mind returned to his father's lesson, the mantra that had carried him through decades of challenges. Stand your ground. Do not yield. Dignity is not optional. He tightened his grip slightly on the folio resting on his lap, as though anchoring himself to the weight of those words. The family had disappeared into the rows behind the curtain. Chloe lingered near the galley, whispering with another attendant. Their hushed voices carried tension, their glances flicking occasionally toward seat 2A. Adrian knew the moment was not over. It had only begun. The stillness of the cabin was deceptive. Beneath it, something heavier brewed, a storm gathering its force. The next step would not come from him, but from those who could not stand to see a man like him hold his ground without question. And so, Adrian remained exactly where he was, unmoved. His very stillness was a declaration, one that every pair of eyes in the cabin would carry with them long after the plane had touched down. The hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, but the cabin had not yet found its peace. The request Chloe Myers had made lingered like a faint shadow, hanging in the space between passengers who were pretending to read or scroll, but were very much attuned to the tension that had taken root. Dr. Adrian Cole sat in Seat 2A, hands resting on his folio, gaze fixed forward. On the surface he appeared composed, a man content to wait for the safety briefing, for the drinks cart, for takeoff. But inside, the moment churned. The simple act of being asked to yield his seat carried the weight of 1,000 echoes from the past. He remembered being a boy, standing in line at a community pool when another child's parent pulled him aside and said the line was not for him. He remembered the boardroom years later when a competitor had dismissed his proposal without reading it, only to realize weeks afterward that his quiet idea was the very one investors demanded. He remembered the sting of being invisible in spaces he had earned, now on an aircraft owned by the very company he had built. He was once again asked to move, not for policy or emergency, but because his presence was deemed negotiable. Adrian's chest rose with a slow inhale, steady and deliberate. He would not let anger spill over. He had learned long ago that visible outrage could be twisted, recast as aggression. He chose instead the discipline of stillness, yet stillness was not silence. Stillness had its own voice, one that reverberated more deeply because it required no volume. Across the aisle, Gregory Lane leaned back in his seat with a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He had not been asked to move, though his seat was no less valuable. no less suited to accommodate the family. He had watched the entire exchange with detached amusement, his eyes glinting as if enjoying a private performance. To him, it was entertainment. To Adrian, it was another chapter in a book that had been written too many times before. In 1B, Evelyn Hart closed her bag slowly. She had been watching carefully, every word, every pause. She could see the difference in how Chloe had spoken to Adrian compared to others. It was not merely a polite request gone wrong. It was layered with assumptions, subtle but undeniable. Evelyn felt the heaviness of it press into her chest. She wanted to speak, to intervene, but the fear of drawing attention to herself pinned her to her seat. She looked at Adrian, her lips parting as though to say something, but no words came. Adrian turned his head slightly, just enough to glance toward Chloe, who lingered near the galley. She avoided his eyes, pretending to adjust a tray, her movements sharp and restless. He saw her shoulders rise and fall with tension. She was young, perhaps inexperienced, but her decision had not been innocent. She had chosen the easiest target, the man alone, the man whose presence she unconsciously weighed as more expendable than others. Adrian wondered if she realized the message carried in her choice. He wondered if she would reflect on it later, or if she would dismiss it as routine duty. He could have let it pass. He could have surrendered the seat with a polite nod, slipped into another row, allowed the family to sit together, and told himself it was no great sacrifice. But what then? Another small concession swallowed, another stone added to the pile. Dignity lost not in great battles, but in quiet surrenders. He thought of his daughter again, Maya. Her voice echoed in his mind, sharp with conviction. Dad, you cannot always be the one to keep the peace. Sometimes peace comes only when someone is willing to shatter the silence. He could hear her saying it, could see her pacing the living room, as she often did when passionate about justice. Adrian had smiled at her then, assuring her that there were many ways to fight, that stillness could be its own form of rebellion. But sitting here now, he wondered if she had been right all along. The family had already disappeared behind the curtain, but the mark of their arrival remained. Every passenger who had witnessed the request now carried it in their minds, even if they pretended not to. Adrian could feel their eyes darting toward him in quiet intervals, some filled with sympathy, others with judgment, and a few with discomfort born of complicity. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that grows louder with every passing second. He decided to break it, but gently. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried across the cabin with ease. So let me ask this, Adrian said, turning his gaze toward Chloe, who finally looked at him, her eyes wide. Am I being asked to move because I am traveling alone, or because I do not fit the picture of who belongs here? The words dropped like stones into water, rippling outward. A woman in row 3 gasped softly. Gregory's smirk faltered, though he quickly masked it. Evelyn Hart's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone, though she stopped short of raising it. Chloe's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. Sir, please don't misunderstand. We just wanted to help the family sit together. There was no other meaning behind it. Adrian's gaze did not waver. He did not raise his voice, but his silence after her answer was sharper than any rebuttal. His eyes told the truth she could not admit aloud. The unease in her posture, the tremor in her voice, the way she had chosen only him, it was all there. He finally spoke again, softly but firmly. You have already made this situation uncomfortable. The sentence landed like a verdict. Chloe stepped back as if struck, her shoulders sagging beneath the weight of her own actions. She murmured something indistinct and retreated toward the galley. The cabin remained suspended in silence, every passenger holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Adrian leaned back once more, his body steady, his face calm. Inside, though, a storm raged. Part of him longed to release the frustration building in his chest, to speak the truth plainly, to demand accountability. But another part of him whispered caution. He had always believed that true strength was not in shouting, but in choosing when not to. He pressed his palms together, closed his eyes briefly, and let the hum of the engine steady him. In that moment he made a quiet vow. He would not yield. He would not allow another quiet surrender to erase what he had built within himself. His seat was more than a seat. It was a symbol, and he would hold it, not only for himself, but for every moment in his life when dignity had been tested. Around him the cabin began to breathe again, passengers shifting, whispering. Some admired him, some judged him. All of them, whether they admitted it or not, had been changed by what they had witnessed. Adrian opened his eyes, his gaze steady once more. The storm was not over. In fact, it was only beginning. He could feel it in the tension of the air, in the quickened steps of the attendants, in the stiff posture of the supervisor who was making his way down the aisle. The next confrontation was approaching, and Adrian, calm and unmoved, was ready. The first-class cabin had fallen into an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that makes even the soft rustle of a newspaper sound too loud. The family that sparked the request had already vanished behind the curtain into the main cabin, but the mark of the moment lingered like a bruise. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to focus on their magazines, their phones, their books. But their attention returned again and again to Seat 2A, where Dr. Adrian Cole sat, still and composed. Every detail of his presence was deliberate. His posture was upright, not rigid, but grounded, his hands resting lightly on the folio in his lap. He seemed to radiate calm, but beneath the surface a storm of thoughts pressed at the edges of his composure. He could feel the tension of eyes darting toward him, could sense the discomfort rolling through the cabin like a current. He knew something else was coming. The sound of firm footsteps confirmed it. From the galley at the front of the plane, a man appeared. His uniform was crisp. His silver tie clip gleamed under the cabin lights. The name tag on his chest read, David Rowan. His stride carried authority, the kind of practiced confidence that comes from years of being the final voice in tense situations. Passengers straightened in their seats as he approached, as though instinctively recognizing him as someone in command. Rowan stopped beside Adrian's seat, planting his feet wide enough to suggest immovability. His tone was not hostile, but it was firm, carrying the edge of someone who expected compliance. "Sir," Rowan began, his voice steady, "I understand there's been some resistance to a request made by one of our flight attendants. For the sake of avoiding further complications, I'm asking you to cooperate. It will help us get this flight underway without delay." Adrian turned his head slowly, meeting Rowan's eyes. His own gaze was calm but piercing, steady enough to make Rowan's words falter slightly. Adrian did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, the kind of silence that forces the other person to recognize its weight. When he did respond, his tone was even, almost quiet, but it carried through the cabin. "I have a valid ticket," Adrian said. "I boarded this flight as instructed. I am seated in the place I paid for. Remaining in my seat is not a disruption." Rowan's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked briefly toward other passengers who were now openly watching, then back to Adrian. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, though still audible to those nearby. "If you don't comply, sir, we may have to consider asking you to deplane. We cannot allow passengers to create obstacles that affect boarding or service." The words landed heavily, a clear escalation. A murmur ran through the cabin, soft but unmistakable. Evelyn Hart felt her pulse quicken as she clutched her phone, fingers brushing the record button. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Adrian Cole had not raised his voice, had not stood, had not obstructed anyone. He had simply refused to surrender his seat, and yet here he was being threatened with removal. Adrian's heart tightened in his chest. A flicker of anger stirred inside him, sharp and hot. He wanted to say the words that burned on his tongue, that the request had not been fair, that others had not been asked, that this was about more than convenience. He wanted to expose the bias woven into the very fabric of the moment. But he steadied himself, inhaled slowly, and held to the discipline that had carried him through decades of challenges. Raising his voice would satisfy the expectations of those who already doubted him. Losing his composure would allow them to rewrite the narrative, to say he had been the problem. He would not give them that satisfaction. His response was measured, his tone controlled, each word placed with care. With respect. Mr. Rowan, keeping my assigned seat is not an obstacle. It is the very definition of compliance. The supervisor's expression darkened, frustration creeping into his eyes. He had expected resistance to crumble under the pressure of authority. Instead, he found himself facing a man who would not bend, who would not be intimidated into surrender. Rowan straightened, his posture stiffening, but he said nothing more. The silence that followed was electric. It filled every corner of the cabin, pressing down on the shoulders of passengers who watched with rapt attention. Some were uncomfortable, others quietly impressed. Gregory Lane smirked again, clearly entertained by the spectacle, but even he shifted uneasily under Adrian's unwavering composure. Inside. Adrian felt the struggle raging. Part of him wanted to let it go, to avoid escalation, to spare himself the indignity of being singled out further. But another part of him, deeper and stronger, reminded him of who he was. He had built this airline. He had designed its vision, charted its routes, ensured its survival. He had created the very seat he sat in. And yet here he was, being told he did not belong. The weight of that contradiction pressed against his chest, but it did not break him. Instead, it steeled him. Rowan stepped back slightly, his voice clipped as he said, "I'll return shortly." He turned and walked toward the front of the plane, his stride brisk, his shoulders rigid. Chloe Myers glanced nervously in his direction before slipping into the galley behind him. Adrian remained seated, his breathing steady. The moment stretched like taut wire. He knew the situation had not been resolved. Rowan would return, perhaps with more authority, perhaps with a final demand. The storm had not yet broken. Evelyn Hart leaned back in her seat, her eyes still on Adrian. She was struck not just by his refusal, but by the way he carried it. He did not posture, did not lash out. His very stillness commanded respect. She wondered who he was, what gave him such presence, such quiet strength. Something told her that his story was larger than this single moment. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, retreating inward. He thought of his daughter again, her voice urging him to fight, to push back openly. He thought of his father, reminding him that sometimes the most powerful stand is the one taken without movement. Both voices collided inside him, urging him in different directions. He wrestled with the tension, the desire to speak truth plainly, and the discipline to let silence speak louder. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was clear. He would not yield. He would not allow himself to be erased quietly. Whatever came next, he would meet it with composure and conviction. The hum of the engines grew louder, as baggage was loaded below. The cabin air seemed heavier, the glances sharper, the unspoken anticipation building. Everyone knew the confrontation was not over. Everyone sensed the moment was about to shift again. And Adrian, steady in seat 2A, waited with the patience of a man who understood that sometimes dignity demands you stand firm even when the world expects you to move. The hum of the engines deepened, blending with the faint hiss of circulating air. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding completed, but no one in first class seemed settled. The atmosphere had grown too tense, too charged with the memory of what had just unfolded. Conversations were hushed, glances sharp and fleeting. Everyone knew that Supervisor David Rowan's return would decide how this strange standoff continued. Dr. Adrian Cole sat unmoving in seat 2A. His hands rested lightly on his folio, his shoulders relaxed, but his mind worked like a storm beneath the calm. He replayed Rowan's words in his head. Deplane, cooperation, disruption. Words dressed in professionalism but sharpened by bias. He had done nothing more than remain in his seat, and yet he had been cast as the obstacle. The familiar frustration rose again, pressing hot against his chest. He fought it down with slow, steady breaths. He could not give them anger. Anger would only be weaponized against him. But neither could he allow silence to be mistaken for surrender. He had chosen stillness as resistance. But now the time for stillness alone had passed. Rowan reappeared at the front of the cabin, his posture rigid, his expression stern. He held a small notepad, flipping it closed as he moved down the aisle. Passengers tensed, their bodies stiffening as though bracing for impact. Chloe Myers trailed behind him, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously toward Adrian. Rowan stopped again beside Seat 2A. His voice was low, but carried authority. "Sir, we need a final decision. If you will not cooperate, we will have to delay this departure, and I assure you, the consequences of that will be significant." The silence that followed was heavy. A woman in the second row coughed softly, the sound far too loud in the stillness. Adrian's heart beat steady, his mind clear. This was no longer about a seat. It was about dignity, about truth, about whether he would once again be asked to step aside to make others comfortable. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Every movement was deliberate, precise. His fingers closed around his phone. He placed it gently on his lap, tapped the screen, and unlocked it with a calm swipe. His composure did not waver. Rowan shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He had expected resistance, perhaps protest, perhaps pleading. He had not expected this measured ritual, this quiet preparation. Adrian scrolled to a contact he knew by heart. Linda Warren, Chief Executive Officer of Aurelius Airways, his partner in building the empire, his ally, his colleague, the public face of the airline he had created. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, professional, unwavering. Linda Warren. Adrian did not waste time. He did not explain, did not justify, did not plead. He spoke 3 words, his tone steady as stone. Delay the flight. Then he ended the call. The simplicity of the action stunned the cabin. Passengers froze mid-breath, their eyes wide. The sound of the engines faded into the background as if the entire aircraft held its breath. Rowan's jaw tightened. He shifted again, glancing toward the galley, then back at Adrian. Something in his posture changed, a recognition dawning slowly. This was no ordinary passenger. This was not a man who could be pressured into compliance with vague threats. Behind Rowan, Chloe's lips parted as though to speak. then closed again. She seemed to sense the shift too, though she did not yet understand its full weight. The ripple began almost immediately. A delay message was transmitted to the ground crew. The loading vehicles stopped. The luggage cart stood still on the tarmac. Mechanics paused mid-step. Time itself seemed to stall. Inside the cabin, whispers broke out. "Why aren't we moving?" a man asked in row 3. A woman leaned toward her companion and murmured, "Did he just call someone?" Children in the back squirmed, tugging at seatbelts, asking why the plane wasn't taking off. Adrian sat still, phone resting once more in his lap, his gaze fixed forward. He said nothing more, but his silence carried the weight of unseen authority. He knew Linda would act immediately, and her word would cascade through the airline's chain of command like a commandment. Rowan stepped back, confusion warring with irritation. He turned, muttered something into his radio, then disappeared again toward the galley. Chloe lingered a moment longer, staring at Adrian with wide eyes. She seemed about to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a defense, but the words never formed. She followed Rowan forward, leaving Adrian once again in his quiet fortress of composure. The cabin remained tense, but the energy had shifted. Where moments ago Adrian had been the target of scrutiny, now he had become the center of intrigue. Gregory Lane leaned over slightly in 2C, his smirk replaced by something closer to curiosity. He whispered to himself, "Who the hell is this guy?" Evelyn Hart's eyes glimmered with recognition. She had suspected there was more to the man in 2A. Now she was certain. She unlocked her phone, opened her notes app, and began typing quickly. She wanted to record every detail while it was fresh. Minutes passed. Passengers grew restless. Some pulled out their phones, scrolling for updates, searching for answers. A buzz of speculation ran through the rows. Out on the tarmac, a sleek black SUV rolled up beside the aircraft. Its windows were tinted, its movements precise, purposeful. 2 executives in dark suits stepped out, their expressions grave, their strides unhurried, but filled with intent. They carried no luggage, no equipment, only the weight of authority. They climbed the portable stairs, their polished shoes ringing against the metal. Inside, the cabin grew quieter still. Every eye turned toward the aircraft door. Every breath seemed held. Adrian remained calm, his heartbeat steady. He had known this would come. He had known that his 3 words would summon more than just a pause in departure. It would summon accountability. He thought of his daughter again, her fierce voice urging him to confront injustice directly. He thought of his father, reminding him that strength sometimes meant waiting until the exact moment to act. Perhaps, he thought, both were right. Perhaps this was the moment when silence and action converged. The executives reached the front of the cabin. They exchanged a few brief words with Rowan, whose face had flushed with discomfort. Chloe stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes darting nervously. Then Rowan and Chloe were quietly instructed to step off the plane. The sight was almost surreal. Passengers watched as the supervisor and the attendant who had initiated the request left the cabin, their faces tight with embarrassment, their strides quick and stiff. No explanation was given, no announcement made, only the hush of collective judgment that followed them out the door. Adrian did not move. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply remained in his seat, calm and steady, the picture of composure. Around him, the whispers spread. Phones were raised. Messages were typed. Photos were snapped. Passengers leaned toward one another, their voices hushed, but urgent. He must be someone important. Did you see how they just left? What's happening? Evelyn Hart kept her phone low, recording discreetly. She knew this moment would matter, She knew the world beyond this cabin would want to see it. Adrian leaned back slightly, resting his head against the seat. His eyes closed for just a moment. He felt the weight of history pressing on him, the echoes of every time he had been asked to move, to yield, to step aside. But now the echoes were being rewritten. This time he had not moved. This time the world would move around him. The engines hummed on. The cabin lights glowed. Outside, the SUV remained, its presence a silent reminder that something larger than a seat dispute was unfolding. Adrian Cole sat in 2A, steady as stone, and the balance of power in the cabin had shifted forever. The delay stretched into minutes that felt like hours. The engines idled with a low vibration, their steady hum almost mocking the silence that had settled across the first-class cabin. Outside, the autumn light had begun to fade, the golden glow dimming into a soft haze over the tarmac. Passengers fidgeted in their seats, exchanging murmurs, checking their watches, tapping out hurried messages on their phones. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone understood that it was not ordinary. Dr. Adrian Cole remained in seat 2A, still and composed. His phone rested on his lap, screen dark, his hand placed lightly over it. He had not spoken since his 3 words had changed the course of the flight, but his silence was no longer seen as passive. To those watching, it was the silence of command. The front door of the aircraft opened again with a sharp hiss, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. 2 executives stepped into the cabin. Their suits were cut sharp, their movements deliberate. One was a tall man with graying temples and a jaw set like stone. The other was a woman with sleek black hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and assessing as they scanned the rows. The passengers straightened, their attention locked on the pair. No announcement was made, no explanation offered, but everyone could feel the gravity of their presence. This was no routine check. This was intervention. The 2 executives exchanged a few hushed words with David Rowan, who stood stiffly at the front of the cabin, his shoulders tense. Chloe Myers lingered beside him, her face pale, her hands twisting together nervously. The exchange was brief, low enough that passengers could not hear. But the outcome was visible in Rowan's expression. His jaw clenched. His eyes flicked toward Adrian, and then his face flushed with something between frustration and shame. Within moments, Rowan and Chloe were quietly instructed to gather their things. No dramatic announcement, no confrontation, just a simple, decisive directive. Their removal was swift, almost surgical. They walked down the aisle with faces tight, their footsteps heavy against the carpet. Passengers followed them with their eyes, whispers darting between seats. Adrian did not move. He did not look at them as they passed. He simply remained seated, the very image of composure. The contrast was stark, where Rowan and Chloe seemed diminished, weighed down by embarrassment. Adrian radiated stillness, an anchor in the shifting current. When the 2 exited, a hush fell over the cabin once more. Then, as if on cue, a new team of attendants entered. Their uniforms were immaculate, their smiles genuine. They carried themselves with a kind of poise that seemed to reset the atmosphere. The lead attendant, a woman with strands of gray in her hair and eyes that shone with warmth, approached Adrian first. She spoke in a voice both formal and deeply considerate. "Mr. Cole, we have arranged alternatives for your comfort. If you prefer, a private lounge is prepared for you with every amenity. Or, if you wish to remain here, we are honored to serve you in this seat." Adrian lifted his eyes to meet hers. Her sincerity was unmistakable. He inclined his head slightly and spoke with quiet certainty. "I'll remain here." It was not stubbornness. It was necessity. Seat 2A had become more than a seat. It was a statement, a marker of dignity not to be relinquished. To leave it now would be to accept the very erasure that had sparked this ordeal. Remaining was not just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told to move, to yield, to step aside. The attendant nodded with respect. She did not press further. She simply smiled softly, adjusted his tray table, and stepped back. The sincerity in her actions contrasted so sharply with the earlier exchange that several passengers murmured their approval. The cabin shifted again. Where once there had been tension and suspicion, now there was reverence. Passengers began to look at Adrian differently. Some offered subtle nods of acknowledgement. Others simply sat quietly, processing what they had witnessed. A transformation was underway, not in policy manuals or corporate directives, but in the perceptions of those present. Gregory Lane, who had smirked through the earlier drama, now sat upright, his eyes fixed on Adrian with a mix of curiosity and unease. He no longer found amusement in the moment. Something in Adrian's calm had unsettled him, forced him to reflect in ways he had not expected. Evelyn Hart continued to type on her phone, her fingers racing to capture every detail. She glanced at Adrian from time to time, admiration clear in her eyes. She had witnessed many things in her life, but rarely had she seen dignity wielded with such quiet force. She knew instinctively that this story would ripple far beyond the cabin. Outside the aircraft, the black SUV still idled, a silent sentinel on the tarmac. Ground crew stood still, waiting for instructions. The ripple effect of Adrian's 3 words stretched far beyond the rows of first class. It reached into operations rooms, into board offices, into the core of the company itself. Inside, the new attendants began their work with professionalism and grace. Their smiles were no longer forced, their tone no longer perfunctory. They moved with the awareness that they were part of something larger, that their actions now carried the weight of scrutiny and symbolism. Every gesture seemed touched by sincerity. Adrian remained calm, his eyes closed briefly as he leaned back into his seat. He allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of Maya again, her voice urging him to fight openly. He thought of his father's lessons about patience and stillness. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that both paths converged here. His stillness had become action. His silence had become a roar louder than any raised voice. The murmurs in the cabin grew. Passengers speculated about who he was, why the executives had listened, why the crew had been replaced so swiftly. Theories spread like sparks in dry grass. Some guessed he was a high-ranking government official. Others thought he was a billionaire investor. Few realized the truth that he was the very architect of the airline itself. Evelyn suspected. She studied him with sharper eyes now, recognizing the aura of someone accustomed to responsibility at the highest levels. She did not know his name yet, but she felt certain she would soon. Adrian folded his hands once more over his folio, his posture steady. The storm had not ended. He knew there would be more to come. But for now, the cabin had been transformed. What began as an attempt to diminish him had become a demonstration of respect, not because he demanded it with volume, but because he refused to yield with silence. The engines hummed on, the lights glowed warm, and the tarmac outside remained still. Yet within that stillness, change had already begun to tremble through the very foundation of Aurelius Airways. And Adrian Cole, seated calmly in 2A, was at the center of it all. The engines continued their idle hum, vibrating softly through the floor. But the stillness inside the cabin had become almost unbearable. Time seemed suspended, each minute dragging like an hour as passengers waited for clarity. The replacement crew had settled into their stations, their poise and sincerity a stark contrast to the unease that had hung in the air moments earlier. Yet the question lingered. Unspoken but insistent, who was the man in seat 2A? Adrian Cole sat quietly, his hands folded over his folio once more, his posture unchanging. He had not moved since the executives had come and gone, since Rowan and Chloe had been escorted off the plane. His silence was more commanding than any speech could have been. He was calm, yes, but his calmness was not passive. It radiated strength, the kind of strength that draws every eye without asking for it. Whispers began at the edges of the cabin. A woman in row 3 leaned toward her seatmate, her voice a hushed rush. "Did you see? They actually pulled the supervisor off the plane. I've never seen anything like that." Her companion nodded, casting a discreet glance toward Adrian, and he didn't even raise his voice. He just sat there. Who has that kind of power phones lit up? Passengers scrolled through feeds, typed hurried messages, tried to find explanations. One man searched the airline stock ticker, wondering if a delay of this scale might already be making ripples on Wall Street. Another scoured news sites, checking for mentions of an incident aboard the flight. Nothing had appeared yet, but Evelyn Hart, seated just ahead of Adrian, was faster. She had recorded discrete clips during the confrontation, her phone angled low in her lap. Now she replayed them, listening to the calm steadiness of Adrian's voice, the sharp contrast between his composure and Rowan's clipped tone. She debated with herself. Should she post it? Should she wait? She understood the power of these images. She knew that once they entered the online world, they would not come back. She glanced at Adrian. He sat still, eyes closed for a brief moment, as though resting in the middle of a storm. Evelyn hesitated. She did not want to exploit him, but she also believed the world needed to see this. She opened her social media app, selected a clip of Rowan warning Adrian about being deplaned, and posted it with a single caption: "First class. Flight 451. Watch carefully who's being asked to move." Within minutes, the post began to circulate. Likes, comments, shares. A slow trickle at first, then a steady stream. Evelyn felt her phone buzz with notifications as the clip traveled beyond her circle, picked up by strangers, spreading into the wider digital ether. Inside the cabin, the whispers grew louder. Gregory Lane leaned toward the passenger across the aisle, his voice low but audible enough for Adrian to hear. "He's somebody. You don't just make a call and ground a flight like that. Maybe he's an investor or some government official." The other man shook his head. "Government officials don't get crews replaced like that. That's something else." Adrian kept his gaze forward, his composure intact. He did not need to confirm or deny. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. A young woman seated near the curtain gasped suddenly as she scrolled through her phone. She turned to her friend, her voice rising with excitement. "Look, this post already has thousands of views. People are saying he might be Adrian Cole, the founder of Aurelius Airways." Heads turned. The name rippled through the rows like a spark catching dry leaves. Adrian Cole, founder, Aurelius Airways. Passengers exchanged glances, some incredulous, others wide-eyed with dawning realization. Evelyn looked back over her shoulder, her eyes meeting Adrian's for the first time since she had posted the video. She saw the faint flicker of acknowledgement in his gaze, the quiet acceptance that the truth was now stepping out of shadow. The murmurs grew bolder. "Wait, if that's true, then this is his airline. He owns this plane. No wonder they pulled the crew." Gregory Lane's smirk had vanished entirely. He sat back in his seat, his jaw tightening as he processed the revelation. The man he had dismissed with casual indifference was not just another passenger. He was the architect of the entire airline, the very reason Gregory could sit there sipping champagne. The new lead attendant returned, her demeanor respectful as she addressed Adrian. "Mr. Cole, Is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable while we finalize preparations? The use of his name confirmed what Whispers had only speculated. Adrian inclined his head slightly, his voice steady. No, thank you. I'm fine here. The confirmation struck the cabin like a bell. Every passenger now knew for certain. The man who had been asked to surrender his seat was the founder of Aurelius Airways. The man who had sat silent while threatened with removal was the very owner of the company they were flying with. Phones buzzed again. Posts multiplied. Screens lit up with breaking captions. CEO incident founder on Flight 45E1 Aurelius Airways founder confronted by own staff. Adrian felt the shift without even looking. Respect replaced suspicion. Awe replaced curiosity. But he did not revel in it. For him, this was not about glory. It was about the principle, the dignity that had been challenged and defended. He thought again of his father, of Maya, of the generations before him who had been told to yield their place. This moment was not just his. It belonged to them too. The atmosphere in the cabin transformed. Passengers who had been silent now leaned forward to catch a glimpse of him, their eyes filled with admiration or guilt. Some whispered apologies under their breath, though they had said nothing to him directly. Others stared at their phones, rereading the posts as if to confirm what they already knew. Evelyn Hart set her phone down finally, her hands trembling slightly. She had seen how quickly the story was spreading. She turned once more toward Adrian, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you," she said simply. Adrian's eyes met hers. He nodded once, his expression calm, his voice quiet but resonant. "For what? For not moving," she replied. Her words hung in the air, simple but profound. Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer, then returned his eyes forward. He said nothing more, but inside he felt the weight of her gratitude and the truth behind it. His decision to remain seated had become more than personal. It had become symbolic. The replacement crew continued their quiet preparations. The executives remained at the front, their presence a silent reminder that the incident was being monitored closely. Outside, the tarmac glowed under fading sunlight, the black SUV still parked beside the plane. And in seat 2A, Adrian Cole sat unmoved as whispers grew into recognition and recognition into revelation. The world outside was beginning to watch, and the story was only just unfolding. The delay stretched longer, but no one in the cabin complained. Their eyes were locked on their phones, screens glowing in the dimmed light as the story of Flight 451 began to spiral outward. Evelyn Hart's video had left the walls of the cabin, spilling into the digital world where nothing remained small for long. The clip of David Rowan warning Adrian Cole about being deplaned circulated with lightning speed. In less than 20 minutes, it appeared across platforms, reshared with captions that questioned, demanded, and speculated. Passenger threatened for refusing to give up seat. One post read, "Another was more direct is this Adrian Cole, founder of Aurelius Airways." The comments multiplied faster than anyone on board could follow. Some viewers expressed outrage, their words sharp with indignation. Others expressed disbelief, demanding to know if the man in the clip truly was the CEO. Hashtags sprouted like weeds. Seat 2A. Easy dignity in flight. Who hoons the air? Inside the cabin. The shift was palpable. Passengers no longer whispered cautiously. They murmured openly now, their eyes darting between Adrian and their phones. The quiet storm that had brewed within the aircraft was merging with the digital storm rising outside. Adrian sat still, his phone resting unused on his lap. He did not need to check the feeds to know what was happening. He had lived long enough, built enough, endured enough to recognize the rhythm of stories when they broke free. Once out, They could not be recalled. Yet his mind churned. He wondered how the narrative would be shaped, whether it would capture the truth of what had happened or twist it into something distorted. He thought of Maya again, her fiery insistence that silence only allowed others to control the story. Perhaps, he thought, her words were proving themselves true. Still, he did not regret his choice to remain calm. His stillness was not absence. It was power. The executives at the front of the plane whispered urgently among themselves, their phones pressed to their ears, their voices low and tense. They were no longer managing a simple cabin dispute. They were managing a public relations crisis with the company's very identity at stake. Far across the city, in the glass-walled headquarters of Aurelius Airways, phones rang with relentless urgency. Linda Warren stood at the head of a long mahogany conference table, her sharp eyes moving from one executive to another as reports poured in. Screens along the wall displayed live updates from social platforms, news outlets, and the airline's own customer service lines, now flooded with inquiries. Linda's voice cut through the chaos. We need clarity. Now. Who was responsible for this? A manager from operations cleared his throat nervously. It was Rowan, ma'am, and a junior attendant named Myers. They asked him to move, and when he refused, Rowan threatened to deplane him. Linda's jaw tightened, her voice dropped, controlled but fierce. Do they know who they threatened? They know now, the manager said quietly. Silence gripped the room. Everyone understood the weight of that truth. Adrian Cole was not just another passenger. He was the architect of the airline, the man who had built its foundation with vision and resolve. To treat him with such disregard was more than a mistake. It was an indictment of the very culture he had tried to shape. Back on the plane, Evelyn refreshed her phone and gasped softly. It's everywhere, she whispered, turning the screen so the passenger beside her could see. The clip had been picked up by a major news account, its headline blunt, Founder of Aurelius Airways confronted by own crew. Gasps rippled through the cabin as others confirmed the headline on their own screens. Some passengers stared openly at Adrian now, their eyes wide with recognition and respect. Others averted their gaze, guilt tugging at them for the silent judgments they had made earlier when they thought he was just another man taking up a first-class seat. Gregory Lane sank lower into his chair, his earlier smirk gone completely. He rubbed his jaw, his mind racing. He had dismissed Adrian without a second glance, and now the truth pressed against him like a mirror he didn't want to face. Adrian felt the shift, but did not move. He kept his breathing slow, his posture steady. He had not asked for recognition. He had not sought the spotlight. But it had found him, and he knew now that the story was no longer his alone. It belonged to the passengers, to the cameras, to the world that watched and interpreted and judged. He closed his eyes briefly and thought of his father. He remembered a phrase spoken in the quiet of their home years ago. The true test of dignity isn't when you're treated well. It's when you're treated as though you're not worthy of it, and you refuse to believe the lie. Those words burned in his memory now, steadying him as the storm grew louder. The executives returned to the cabin, their expressions strained. They spoke briefly with the captain, who nodded and relayed instructions into his headset. Passengers watched with rapt attention, each movement analyzed, each gesture carrying meaning. One of the executives approached Adrian's row. His tone was respectful, his body angled slightly forward in deference. Mr. Cole, we are addressing this matter with the utmost seriousness. Please know the company is taking immediate action. You should experience no further issues during this flight. Adrian inclined his head slightly, his voice calm. Thank you. It was a simple exchange, but passengers felt its weight. It confirmed again what they already knew. The man in 2A was not just a passenger. He was the center of gravity in the cabin, the reason everything had shifted. Evelyn finally posted again, this time not a clip, but a reflection. Her words were simple. I watched him sit there without anger, without raising his voice. He didn't move, and the world is moving around him. This is what dignity looks like. Her post exploded with comments. People resonated with the image of quiet defiance, of power expressed not in noise but in calm. They began to tag the airline, demanding answers, demanding accountability. The hashtag MartyC2A began trending globally. Adrian opened his eyes again and glanced briefly at the window. The fading light of evening had cast the runway in a golden haze, but to him it looked like something more. It looked like a crossroads. He wondered what Maya would say if she saw the videos. He imagined her smile, proud and fierce. He wondered if his father, long gone, would nod quietly in approval. He thought of all the unnamed people who had sat in seats they paid for, only to be told to move because they were not deemed worthy. This moment was for them too. The storm was no longer confined to the aircraft. It had broken loose, spreading across the digital sky, rolling through corporate boardrooms, rattling investors, shaking passengers in terminals who watched their screens in disbelief. And at the center of it all, unmoved, unshaken, sat Dr. Adrian Cole. The glow of phones bathed the cabin in cold light. Passengers scrolled feverishly, some whispering in disbelief, others simply staring at the man in seat 2A as though seeing him for the first time. Adrian Cole had not moved. He sat with the same stillness he had carried from the start, his hands folded on his folio, his gaze resting forward. But now, that stillness carried the weight of revelation. They knew his name. They knew his story. The man they had watched, threatened with removal, was the founder of the very airline carrying them across the sky. Every new post online deepened the silence in the cabin. Updates streamed in, comments pouring by the thousands, words like dignity, injustice, respect, and shame threaded themselves through the storm. The passengers could feel it. They were no longer just travelers on a delayed flight. They had become witnesses to a moment that was already stretching beyond them, a moment the world was beginning to dissect. Adrian breathed slowly, steadying himself against the swell of attention. He had never needed an audience. His life had been defined by long hours, careful choices, and battles fought quietly in boardrooms where voices louder than his often filled the air. Yet here, without trying, he had become the center of a stage he had not asked for. His stillness had been magnified by the gaze of strangers and the screens of millions. Far away, in a tower of glass and steel downtown, the boardroom of Aurelius Airways pulsed with frantic energy. Linda Warren stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding yet calm, her voice cutting through the noise of executives speaking over one another. Screens along the walls displayed live streams of social media, headlines flashing faster than they could be read. "Order," Linda said firmly. The room fell silent, though tension buzzed in the air like static before a storm. She looked at the faces around her, leaders of finance, operations, marketing, human resources, men and women who had guided the company through mergers, crises, and expansions. Yet none of those challenges compared to the one unfolding now. "You all know who is on that plane," she said. Her words carried both weight and warning. "Adrian Cole is not just our founder. He is the soul of this airline. Every decision we make from this moment will determine whether we honor what he built or betray it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the table. Some nodded solemnly. Others shifted uneasily. One executive, younger, his tie slightly askew, spoke nervously. "We've already suspended Rowan and Myers pending investigation, but the story is out of our control. Hashtags are trending worldwide. Investors are calling for statements." Linda's gaze sharpened. "Control is not the goal. Accountability is." "If the world sees us scramble to protect reputation while ignoring the truth, we will have failed not only Adrian, but every customer who has ever trusted us." Mark Davis, head of human resources, cleared his throat. "We need systemic reform. Training isn't enough. We must re-examine policies that allow discretion to mask bias. There must be accountability at every level." Susan Lee, Director of Communications, added quickly, "and transparency. If we hide, the public will assume the worst. We need to acknowledge what happened, condemn it, and make visible commitments. Silence is no longer an option." Linda listened, her sharp eyes never leaving theirs. She felt the gravity of the moment pressing against her. She thought of Adrian, of the quiet strength she had always admired in him, the way he led not with noise but with steadiness. She knew what he represented not just to the company, but to the people who believed in it. "Then it's settled," she said finally. "We will respond with clarity and with courage. This is not a PR crisis. This is a reckoning." The words hung heavy, but in them was resolve. The executives leaned forward, ready now not to shield themselves, but to begin the work of reform. Back on the plane. Adrian shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his shoulders against the leather. Around him, passengers watched closely, as though expecting him to speak, to address them directly. But he did not. He knew the power of restraint. He allowed them to sit with what they had seen, to interpret it for themselves. Evelyn Hart glanced back once more, her phone buzzing nonstop with updates. She whispered almost to herself, "The world knows now." She could not shake the awe she felt. Adrian had said so little, yet the entire world was listening. Gregory Lane sat stiffly. His earlier arrogance dissolved into discomfort. He could not meet Adrian's eyes. For the first time, he felt the sting of recognition that his smirk, his dismissiveness, had been witnessed not just by those in the cabin, but potentially by millions. The mirror of his own behavior reflected harshly, and he did not like what he saw. The replacement crew moved gracefully, serving drinks, offering reassurances. But even they were subdued, their actions marked by the awareness that history was being written in their cabin. Adrian leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought of his father again, of long evenings when lessons were delivered not in lectures, but in stories. One in particular returned to him now. "Son," his father had said, "never forget that the world may try to shrink you, but dignity is not theirs to give or take. It is yours to carry, and yours alone." Those words wrapped around him like armor. They steadied him as the buzz of whispers continued, as phones clicked with photographs, as the cabin remained suspended in awe and unease. At headquarters, Linda Warren's meeting reached its conclusion. Plans had been laid, reforms drafted, public statements prepared. But she knew that the true work would not be in words alone. It would be in action, in rebuilding trust, in ensuring that what had happened to Adrian could never happen again. She dismissed the room with a final instruction. Remember this, Adrian did not need to raise his voice. He only needed to remain seated. If we fail to honor that strength with real change, then we have learned nothing. Her words echoed in the silent boardroom as executives filed out, their faces grave, their minds racing. Back in seat 2A, Adrian opened his eyes once more. The storm outside the cabin walls had grown into a hurricane, but inside he remained the calm at its center. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew this a reckoning had begun, and it had started not with a shout, not with anger, but with the simple, unshakable act of refusing to move. The plane had been cleared for departure at last. Nearly an hour had passed since Adrian Cole first refused to surrender his seat. But to the passengers, it felt like they had been living inside a different kind of time stretched by tension, by revelation, by the quiet power of one man's stillness. As the aircraft door sealed with a thud and the engines roared to life, the new crew moved gracefully down the aisle. Their smiles were genuine, their tone respectful, their every gesture deliberate. The passengers sensed the difference. The energy in the cabin was no longer charged with hostility or discomfort. It carried instead a strange kind of reverence. Adrian sat unmoved, fastening his seatbelt with the same deliberate care as always. He leaned back slightly, his gaze steady as the plane began to roll toward the runway. He felt the vibration of the engines through the floor, the subtle shift of momentum as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Yet his thoughts were elsewhere on what had happened, on what it meant, and on what would come next. He thought of the moment Rowan had stood over him, threatening removal. He thought of the unease in Chloe's eyes as she realized the weight of her actions. He thought of the silence in the cabin as passengers watched, their judgment heavy and unspoken. And then he thought of the call. 3 words spoken into the quiet that had altered everything. Delay the flight. The plane accelerated, pressing passengers gently into their seats as the cabin filled with the thunder of engines. Adrian felt the familiar surge, the moment when ground became sky. The ascent was smooth, the horizon tilting as the city fell away beneath them. Lights flickered like stars below, while the real stars began to emerge above. In that quiet ascent, Adrian allowed himself to breathe deeply, to feel the weight lift from his chest. But the struggle within him had not ended. He wrestled with conflicting emotions, anger at the disrespect, sorrow that such indignities still happened, and pride that he had remained composed. Yet beneath it all was something heavier responsibility. He knew the story was no longer his alone. The videos spreading online, the headlines emerging, the hashtags climbing into global conversation, all of it had transformed his personal experience into a symbol. People would look to him now not only as the founder of Aurelius Airways, but as a representative of something larger, the fight for dignity in spaces that often denied it. Evelyn Hart leaned back in her seat, glancing at Adrian once more. She wanted to speak, to thank him again, to tell him how much his composure had meant to her. But she held back. She sensed that he carried enough weight already. That silence was the greatest respect she could give him in that moment. Instead, she simply offered a quiet nod when his eyes briefly met hers. Gregory Lane, by contrast, shifted uncomfortably in 2C. He had no words, no nod, no gesture. He simply stared out the window, the reflection of his face pale in the glass. For perhaps the first time in years, he was forced to reckon with his own assumptions, the ease with which he had dismissed another man. The shame gnawed at him, though he could not name it aloud. The attendants moved with precision, offering drinks and warm towels. When they reached Adrian, their tone carried more than courtesy, it carried respect, even deference. Adrian accepted a glass of water with a quiet "thank you," his eyes soft, but his posture firm. He did not wish to humiliate them. He wanted only what had been his from the start, dignity. As the plane leveled off, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Passengers settled in, but the energy remained different. Some scrolled through their phones, following the online storm. Others sat quietly, reflecting on what they had witnessed. It was as though they understood that they had been present at a moment that would be remembered, retold, reshared. Adrian closed his eyes briefly and thought again of his father. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a boy, watching his father polish his shoes late into the night after long shifts. He remembered the words spoken softly, almost like prayer. "The world may not see your worth, son, but you must never forget it yourself." He thought too of Maya, her youthful fire, her refusal to tolerate injustice in any form. He could almost hear her voice in his ear, half proud, half impatient. "Don't just sit there, Dad. Make them change." He smiled faintly. She was right, of course. Remaining seated had been necessary, but it was only the beginning. True change required more than defiance. It required transformation. Far below, at Aurelius headquarters, Linda Warren's directives were already rippling through the company. Departments were drafting new codes of conduct. HR was preparing comprehensive anti-bias reforms. Communications was shaping a statement to the public. But more importantly, the leadership understood that their founder's experience was not an isolated embarrassment. It was a mirror reflecting flaws in their culture. On board, passengers continued to glance at Adrian, some with admiration, others with guilt. A young man in the third row whispered to his companion, "I'll never forget this." He just sat there, and they had to move around him. That's strength. His words, though quiet, carried meaning beyond the cabin. They echoed the sentiment spreading online, the image of dignity not as loud defiance, but as unshakable presence. Adrian opened his eyes and gazed out the window. The night sky stretched endlessly, the stars shimmering against the darkness. He felt small and infinite at once. The hum of the engine steadied him, a reminder of the machine he had helped build, the airline that carried thousands every day. He thought of the future, not just his own, but the companies, the industries, and the countless travelers who deserved respect no matter their seat, their skin, or their story. He resolved that when the plane landed, his silence would end. He would speak, not for himself alone, but for everyone who had ever been asked to move when they belonged. But for now, in the quiet cabin suspended miles above the earth, he allowed the silence to linger. It was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of reverence, of a man whose stillness had spoken louder than any shout. And though the storm outside continued to rage, Adrian Cole sat calmly in Seat 2A, knowing that the reckoning had already begun. The night sky stretched endlessly outside the windows, a blanket of stars scattered across a canvas of black. The engines hummed steady, carrying the aircraft across the miles between Chicago and Denver. In the cabin, the passengers sat quietly, each wrapped in private thought. They had spoken enough, whispered enough, speculated enough. Now silence had taken hold, but it was not the silence of tension. It was something deeper, heavier, the silence of reflection. Dr. Adrian Cole remained in seat 2A, the very place where the confrontation had begun. He had not moved, not once, since the moment he had been asked to give it up. That refusal had become more than a decision. It had become a statement. And now, as the plane descended slowly toward Denver, the truth of that statement lingered in the air like a presence that could not be ignored. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional, announcing their approach. The passengers shifted, gathering belongings, tightening seatbelts. But their movements lacked the usual impatience of travelers eager to disembark. Instead, there was a certain solemnity, as though they understood that stepping off this plane meant leaving behind something larger than themselves. Adrian glanced out the window as the city lights of Denver glittered into view below. The familiar grid stretched wide, golden points of light against the darkness, each one representing lives, stories, journeys. He thought about the journey that had unfolded here, not just for him, but for every soul on board. This was no ordinary flight. It had become a parable, a living lesson about dignity, power, and justice. Inside, the murmurs began again, not speculative now, but reverent. A man in the third row leaned toward his wife. "I'll never forget this flight, not because of the delay, but because of him." He nodded discreetly toward Adrian. His wife agreed softly, her eyes glistening. He didn't have to shout. He just stayed still, and everything changed. Gregory Lane sat rigid in 2C, his eyes fixed on his phone, though he barely scrolled. The weight of shame pressed heavy against him. He had mocked Adrian in silence, dismissed him with a smirk, assumed superiority without a second thought. And now the world knew who Adrian was, and Gregory could not escape the mirror that had been held to his own behavior. He thought about approaching him, about apologizing, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he remained silent, forced to sit with his discomfort. Evelyn Hart glanced back one final time, her phone buzzing with endless notifications. She had not intended to become part of a viral storm, but the video she had shared was everywhere now, reshaping conversations, sparking debates, inspiring calls for change. She caught Adrian's eye, offered him the same quiet nod as before. He returned it gently, his expression calm, steady, and grateful. No words were necessary between them. The landing was smooth, the tires kissing the runway with a soft thud, the engines roaring as they slowed the massive machine to a crawl. The lights of Denver International flickered past the windows, reflections glinting in the glass. The cabin erupted in the usual shuffle of movement, but even here, the mood was subdued. People gathered their belongings slowly, glancing toward 2A with quiet respect. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the lead attendant approached Adrian once more. Her tone carried both professionalism and something more humility. "Mr. Cole, thank you for your patience. On behalf of the crew, it has been an honor to serve you." Adrian inclined his head. His voice was soft, but it resonated through the silence. "Thank you. The honor is in being treated with dignity." The words landed heavily, sinking into the ears of every passenger within reach. They were not just words for the attendant, they were a message for everyone, a reminder that dignity should never be conditional, never negotiable. When the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers rose one by one. Yet, unlike most flights, there was no mad rush for the aisle. Many lingered, stealing glances back toward Adrian, whispering their private acknowledgments. Some filmed discreetly, capturing the final image of the man who had refused to move. Adrian rose slowly, gathering his leather folio, sliding it carefully into his briefcase. He moved with deliberate grace, unhurried, each gesture filled with calm authority. When he stepped into the aisle, passengers parted slightly, creating space without being asked. It was subtle, but it carried meaning. Respect had replaced suspicion. Reverence had replaced doubt. As he walked toward the exit, a young woman in row 4 whispered, almost as though speaking to herself, "That's what strength looks like." A man beside her murmured back, "No, that's what justice looks like." Adrian stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the cool air rushing against his face. Outside, the terminal buzzed with ordinary life announcements over loudspeakers, the clatter of luggage wheels, the chatter of travelers. Yet for him, the air felt different. It carried with it the weight of what had begun. At Aurelius headquarters, Linda Warren released a statement even as Adrian walked through the terminal. It was direct, unapologetic, and resolute. She condemned the actions that had taken place on Flight 451, announced the immediate termination of Rowan and Myers, and unveiled sweeping reforms to ensure equity, respect, and accountability across every level of the airline. She closed with a line that echoed Adrian's own quiet message. At Aurelius Airways, dignity is not optional. It is our foundation. The statement spread quickly, pairing with the videos and posts that had already gone viral. For many, it was confirmation that the airline was taking responsibility. For others, it was the beginning of deeper scrutiny. But for all, it was clear that the story of Seat 2A was no longer a private moment. It was a symbol. Adrian paused by a window in the terminal, gazing out at the runway where the aircraft still sat. The hum of engines faded into memory, but the lessons of the flight burned bright. He thought of those who had come before him, who had been asked to move without power to resist. He thought of those who would come after, who deserved to sit in any seat with dignity unquestioned. He placed a hand on the glass, feeling the cool surface against his palm. "This is only the beginning," he murmured to himself. His voice was quiet, but it carried the certainty of a vow. He walked on, his steps steady, his presence commanding without effort. Passengers who recognized him from the flight followed with their eyes, some lifting their phones, others simply holding the memory close. They knew they had witnessed something more than an incident. They had witnessed a reminder of what dignity could do when it refused to yield. Adrian Cole disappeared into the flow of the terminal, just another traveler walking beneath the bright lights and endless signs. But the world knew better now. The world knew the power of a seat not surrendered. And from that night forward, the story of Flight 451 lived on not as a tale of conflict, but as a symbol of quiet revolution. Sometimes the loudest voice is not the one that shouts, but the one that refuses to move. Dr. Adrian Cole's choice to remain seated in 2A became more than a personal stand. It became a symbol for anyone who has ever been told to step aside, to give up what they rightfully earned. On Flight 451, passengers witnessed more than a delay. They witnessed dignity under fire, strength in silence, and justice unfolding not through anger, but through quiet resolve. And while reforms may follow, the greater lesson lives in us to treat every person with fairness, to honor worth without condition, and to stand against the small acts of prejudice that echo into something much larger. As we leave this story, may it remind us that dignity is not negotiable, and respect is not a privilege, it is a right. Hold this truth close, and let it shape how you see others, and how you carry yourself. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us for more stories that reveal not only injustice, but the hope and humanity that rise from it.